The year 1833 marked a turning point in human history. It was a year that would be remembered for its monumental shift in the socio-economic landscape of the world. The British Empire, once a major player in the transatlantic slave trade, finally abolished slavery. This decision was the result of decades of relentless campaigning by abolitionists who fought tirelessly against the inhumane practice. This decision sent shockwaves across the world. The abolition of slavery was celebrated as a victory for human rights and justice, a beacon of hope for oppressed people everywhere. However, the end of slavery did not mean the end of exploitation. The demand for cheap labor in the colonies remained high, and the British Empire needed a new solution to sustain its economic interests. From the ashes of one oppressive system rose another, indentured labor. This new system was designed to replace the void left by the abolition of slavery, but it came with its own set of challenges and injustices. This new form of labor would go on to shape the lives of millions in the colonies, particularly those from the Indian subcontinent. The British turned to India, a land with a vast and impoverished population, to fulfill their labor needs. Indentured labor, in essence, was a system of bonded labor. Workers were recruited through contracts that promised them a better life, but the reality was often starkly different. Workers signed contracts, often under duress or misinformation, binding them to work for a specific employer for a fixed period. These contracts were typically written in English, a language many of the laborers did not understand, leading to further exploitation. This period typically lasted for 5 to 7 years. During this time, the laborers were subjected to harsh working conditions and had little to no rights. In exchange for their labor, they were promised passage to the colonies, basic necessities like food and shelter, and meager wages. The journey to the colonies was often perilous, with many laborers facing illness and death before even reaching their destination. However, the reality of indenture was far from the promises made. The living conditions were deplorable, the work was grueling, and the wages were barely enough to survive. The system of indentured labor was particularly prevalent in the British colonies after the abolition of slavery. It became the backbone of the colonial economy, ensuring that the plantations continued to thrive. Plantations in the Caribbean, Mauritius, Fiji, and other parts of the world were left without a workforce. The British needed to find a way to keep these plantations operational, and indentured labor was their solution. The British, desperate to maintain their economic interests, turned to India, a land teeming with a vast and impoverished population, as a new source of cheap labor. The recruitment process was often deceitful, with agents promising a better life abroad only to deliver the laborers into a new form of servitude. The abolition of slavery in 1833 marked a significant turning point in history. It was a monumental decision that aimed to end centuries of inhumane treatment and forced labor. However, this decision created a vacuum in the British colonies, particularly in the vast plantation fields that had relied heavily on slave labor. Plantation owners, who had grown accustomed to a workforce they could control absolutely, were suddenly faced with the daunting prospect of paying for labor. This was a radical shift from the status quo. This did not sit well with them. The idea of having to pay wages to workers was met with resistance and frustration. They argued vehemently that free labor would be too expensive and would cripple their businesses, leading to economic ruin. The British government, though morally compelled to end slavery, was also keen on maintaining the economic viability of its colonies. They needed a solution that would balance both ethical considerations and economic interests. This is where the idea of indentured labor took root. It was proposed as a middle ground, a way to replace the lost slave labor without completely disrupting the economic structure. Indentured labor was seen as a convenient solution, a way to appease both the abolitionists who fought for human rights and the plantation owners who were concerned about their profits. The system, they argued, was fundamentally different from slavery. Indentured laborers were not being bought and sold as property. After all, indentured laborers were signing contracts of their own free will, agreeing to work for a set number of years in exchange for passage, food, and shelter. They were not being bought and sold as property, but rather entering into a contractual agreement. However, this was a flimsy justification. The reality was far more complex and often grim. The reality was that the line between slavery and indentured labor was often blurred. The working conditions were harsh and the expectations were high. The power imbalance between the employer and the worker was stark. Plantation owners still held significant control over the lives of the laborers. The contracts were long and complex, often written in English, a language most potential recruits did not understand. This led to misunderstandings and exploitation. The promises made to these workers were rarely kept. Many found themselves in situations far worse than they had anticipated. The wages were abysmal, the living conditions deplorable, and the punishments harsh. Many indentured laborers faced severe hardships. Indentured laborers had little to no recourse to justice. The legal systems in the colonies were often biased in favor of the plantation owners. They were, for all intents and purposes, trapped in a system designed to exploit them. The dream of a better life quickly turned into a nightmare for many. Families were torn apart, and the hope of returning home seemed distant. The indentured labor system, while different in name, bore many similarities to the slavery it was meant to replace. Over time, the system faced increasing scrutiny and criticism. Debates raged in British Parliament about the ethics and viability of indentured labour. Activists and reformers began to speak out against the injustices faced by indentured labourers, drawing parallels to the recently abolished slavery. Despite the hardships, the resilience of the indentured labourers shone through. They formed communities, supported each other, and fought for their rights. Today, the descendants of these labourers continue to honour their ancestors' struggles and contributions, celebrating their rich cultural heritage. Monuments and memorials stand as a testament to their enduring spirit and the indelible mark they left on history. The end of slavery and the start of indenture is a complex chapter in history, one that reminds us of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. The demand for cheap labour in the British colonies was driven primarily by the lucrative sugar industry. Sugar, often referred to as white gold, was a highly sought-after commodity that fueled the economies of many British colonies. The vast plantations required a large workforce to plant, harvest and process the sugarcane, making labour a critical component of the industry. Sugar was a major commodity in the 19th century, and the Caribbean islands were one of the world's largest producers. The tropical climate and fertile soil made the Caribbean an ideal location for sugar cultivation. The sugar produced in these islands was exported to Europe and North America, where it was used in a variety of products from sweeteners to rum. The abolition of slavery threatened to disrupt this lucrative trade. The British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, which led to the emancipation of slaves in the British Empire. This created a significant labour shortage on the sugar plantations, as the freed slaves were no longer willing to work under the harsh conditions they had endured for so long. Plantation owners needed a new source of labour, one that was both plentiful and inexpensive. They turned to indentured labour as a solution. Indentured labourers were bound by contracts to work for a specific period, usually 5 to 7 years, in exchange for passage, food and shelter. This system allowed plantation owners to maintain their workforce without the legal and moral complications of slavery. India, with its vast population and widespread poverty, became the prime target. The British saw an opportunity to exploit the economic hardships faced by many Indians. The promise of steady work and better living conditions in the colonies was appealing to those struggling to survive in India. The British East India Company, which had already established a strong presence in India, played a key role in facilitating the indentured labour system. The company had extensive networks and resources that allowed them to recruit large numbers of labourers efficiently. They worked closely with local officials and intermediaries to identify potential recruits and arrange their transportation to the colonies. They set up recruitment depots across the country, often targeting the most vulnerable sections of society, the landless poor, the indebted, and the lower castes. These depots were strategically located in areas with high levels of poverty and unemployment. Recruiters would travel to villages and towns, spreading the word about the opportunities available in the colonies. The recruiters used a combination of coercion and deception to lure people into signing indenture contracts. They often exaggerated the benefits and downplayed the challenges of life in the colonies. Some recruiters resorted to outright lies, promising high wages, comfortable living conditions, and even the possibility of owning land. They painted a rosy picture of life in the colonies, promising high wages, comfortable living conditions, and even the possibility of owning land. These promises were particularly enticing to those who had little hope of improving their circumstances in India. Many labourers signed the contracts without fully understanding the terms or the reality of what awaited them. They often exploited the religious beliefs of the largely Hindu and Muslim population, assuring them that they would be able to practice their faith freely in the colonies. This was a significant concern for many Indians who feared that they would be forced to abandon their religious practices if they left their homeland. Recruiters would emphasize the religious freedom in the colonies to gain the trust of potential laborers. The reality, as countless indentured laborers would soon discover, was far from the truth. The working conditions on the plantations were often brutal, with long hours, harsh treatment, and inadequate living conditions. Many laborers found themselves trapped in a cycle of debt and exploitation, unable to return home or improve their situation. The promises of a better life in the colonies turned out to be nothing more than a cruel illusion for many. While the abolition of slavery marked a significant step towards a more just world, the system of indentured labor that followed was, in many ways, slavery by another name. The legal distinction between the two was clear. Indentured laborers were not considered property. They had contracts, however exploitative those contracts may have been. However, in practice, the line between the two systems was often blurred. Indentured laborers, like slaves, had little control over their lives. They were bound to their employers for the duration of their contracts. They were subject to harsh punishments for even minor infractions. Their movements were restricted, and they were often denied basic human rights. The power dynamic was heavily skewed in favor of the employer. The similarities between slavery and indentured labor were not lost on those who experienced it firsthand. Many indentured laborers referred to their situation as a new form of slavery. They were in essence trading one form of servitude for another. The chains may have been invisible, but they were no less real. The system of indentured labor, though legally distinct from slavery, perpetuated many of its worst excesses. It was a system built on exploitation, deception, and the backs of the most vulnerable.